again. I have another sewing project today to share with you. I'm sure if you've been reading a lot about hiking the AT and how to get inexpensive equipment, you have probably heard about the double black diamond throws that you can get at Costco and turn those into an underquilt and a top quilt if you are hammocking, or a lightweight summer quilt for just a little bit more comfort in the warmer seasons. So I was in Costco today and they had these double black diamond throws in 4 different colors. They had gray and purple and this blue and a navy color, and I decided to pick up a couple, and the one I actually decided to use is this gray silver, and it's kind of a two-tone. It's real shiny on one side and a little bit more subtle on the other, but they are super soft, very lightweight, and so I thought this would be a great solution for me in the hotter months to not have to use my sleeping bag, which is pretty warm when it's hot. It's comfortable when it's cold, but it's pretty warm when it's hot. So I'm going to take this and turn it into a quilt that I can use over my sleeping sheet, which I'm going to also be making, and I'll show you that as well. So this quilt, because it is 14 by 12, measures 60 by 70 inches. It's not quite the same dimensions as an actual blanket would be. It's more of a throw. So I'm going to trim off one side to be able to extend the length. It's 60 inches wide. It's wider than I need it to be, just to cover the top of me. So I'm going to trim off 2 squares, and as you can see, I was stitching between, there's square baffles, and I was adding an extra line of stitching so I can very carefully cut in between there and not lose the down. I sewed my extra set of stitching parallel to stitching that was already here, and I made mine very close together. It's probably only not even 1/4 of an inch apart, because I've got good scissors and I know I have a fairly steady hand and I can cut in between without cutting through the stitching. If you're a little bit less comfortable with that tight degree of tolerance, then I would go ahead and just give yourself a little bit more space, maybe 3/8 of an inch between the seams before you cut, and that'll make things a little bit easier for you. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, as I said, very carefully so I don't cut through the stitching. I realized that there were a few areas where my stitching was too close together, and I actually do have some down coming out. So the first thing I'm going to do is to go ahead and put some binding on this edge of the quilt so that this doesn't come out and make a huge mess before I can get further along in the project. To make that binding for the edge of the quilt, I'm going to use what's called bias tape. You can buy it in a package like this. You can get single fold, which is what I'm using, or double fold. The difference, and the reason it's called bias tape, is because it's cut on the diagonal of the fabric, which actually gives it a little bit of stretch. So single fold bias tape comes like this. It's flat, but it's got it's got the edges pressed in. And double fold is actually folded in half like that. So what I did is I just went ahead and pressed this to create double fold bias tape that I can then just wrap around the edge of the quilt like that. Just put it along the edge, and then I'll just stitch it down so that that will keep the down in there and give me a nice finished edge on the quilt. All right, I have finished stitching along the side, so you can see I've got the nice binding, and at the other end I've actually left a little bit because I'm going to be sewing some more quilt onto the end to make it the full length to cover up my whole body. Not that I'm tall, but it'll be nice to have a little bit of extra fabric around my shoulders if I want when it's kind of cool or between seasons. So this part is done, and let's move on. Since I cut off the end, the quilt itself is now, if you're using squares to count, 14 by 10. So I can take this extra piece which I've cut off, which is 2 by 14, take 4 of these and do the same thing, stitch along the side, and hopefully I'll be a little bit neater this time, and use the square that results, this 4 by 2 square, as the base of my foot box, and then the remaining 10 by 2 I can stitch to the top of the quilt, which will give me, as I said, a little bit of extra length and an opportunity to create a toe box when the quilt is closed up, which will give me a little bit more room for my feet. Since I'm an active sleeper, it'll be nice to be able to kind of toss and turn without feeling too confined as I am when I sleep in my mummy bag. Okay, so you can see I have the quilt laid out in its current state, And it's two-tone, as I mentioned, and I've decided that I'm going to actually put the shiny part on the inside and the darker part on the outside. But just for a little touch of variation, style if you will, I'm going to flip the top piece. So when I sew it, it will have kind of a stripe across the top just for a little bit of interest. I have also left a little bit of the binding here, so when I put this on, I can actually extend that all the way up to the top and that edge will be finished. If I was super picky, I would use the same kind of binding on the other side, but it would add a little bit of weight. So what I'm going to do is just leave the existing binding, and it came finished like this with a real fine binding, so I think that that will be just fine. Now down here at the bottom, the piece that I cut for the toe box is 2x4 squares, and I'm going to center it on the bottom because once I sew this, I can bring it around and those two squares will come here and the last square will come here. Okay, so I finished adding the toe box, and if I turn it around wrong side out, you can see I need to cut off a couple of threads here, but have the toe boxes nice and square and turn it right side out. Cut the dark side and a good amount of space for my feet. I left the ends open because I'm going to do one more thing, which is to actually put a drawstring cord across the bottom here so I can cinch it closed underneath my sleeping pad to keep me nice and warm. Now on the top, as I mentioned, I was going to do the contrast, so I've got the two different colors, the shiny and the dark. And what I did is I stitched it together on the back side. It's kind of hard to see, but I did a line of stitching to this way with the two sides raw edges outside, and then I opened it up and I did another line of stitching to keep it nice and flat. So when you look at it from what's going to be the top side, it's kind of got a double row of stitching, and it's got a nice little detail of the color change, which I think is just I don't know, I like it. So anyway, that's where I'm at right now, and I will go ahead and get the drawstring working, and I'll show you how I'm putting that together. Okay, here is the bottom of the quilt. As I showed you, you can see the kind of rectangular toe box, and if you look at this almost as a straight line, it's shorter than the top of the quilt, but that's going to give me an opportunity to wrap it around with the drawstring. And actually, I'm going to use the rest of this bias tape, and I'm going to fold it over and make a channel that I can sew right on the end. Have a helper here. She's already ready to test it out, so say hi, Scout. I've also in my sewing box found this cord, which has got toggles at each end, and I think that's going to be pretty handy. I may switch this out with a little bit of a lighter weight cord. I mean, it's not real heavy, but it's a little thick. So I'm going to use this, make the channel that I sew on the edge here, then I'll thread this through, and then I'll be able to do the drawstring and tighten it up as tight or as loose as I want it when I'm sleeping. So here is the almost finished quilt. You can see where I've added the sleeve to put the cord in. In just a minute, I'm going to get my special tool that I have. It's like a giant needle for pushing these things through, and I'll be able to run that through and tighten it up. Here is that special little tool that I mentioned. It's like a giant needle, and it's got a ball on the other end. Makes it real easy to thread cord through a tube like this one. You don't have to have this. If you just have a big needle that's big enough to get your cord through, that will work just fine. And as you can see, I couldn't use the white cord. It was too thick, so I am using a flat black cord. I think it's actually a shoelace, and I'm going to run this through. And there it is. The cord is in. I've got my toggles. I can pull it tight if I want to keep my feet extra warm. Just pull that real tight, tie it off, and that should be real comfortable. And then if I'd rather use this more loosely as a blanket or something, I can just undo it and spread it out. So I want to show you real quick how I made this little sleep sheet to cover my sleeping pad. It was really easy. I just took a king size sheet and cut it down to match the width of the sleeping pad, and then I also just traced the curve a little bit so that when I put the cords at the ends that it would fit better. Really simple project. I just added a little bit of a channel here at each end to put the cord through. And actually what I used instead of cord, this is called hem tape. It's super lightweight, and the only thing that you would need to do to this is kind of heat up the ends a little bit so that they don't fray, but super lightweight. You can buy this at the fabric store. Use the same thing to create these little tabs along the sides so that we could it wouldn't slide off as I sleep, and I just have enough extra for a bow in each place. And the same thing down here, and if I'd been a little more particular, I might have
done a corner here, but I want to be able to unfold this or take it off and fold it up nice and flat as I put it away in my pack. So really that's pretty much all there is to it. Just a couple of ties at the ends to make it fit securely, ties in the middle so it doesn't slide off, and then you can see when I flip it over that it fits the sleeping pad pretty well, and I can put my quilt over the top, and that's a nice lightweight summer or warm weather sleeping system.